examples of some like feet iterations that I've gone through over the last little bit, making these some different handle things that I've tried out. But really, I'm going for a very like tactile surface. I like when there's something for your hand to explore when you're using an object. Yeah. My entire process for these is using soft slabs. So typically when people think about slab building, they're thinking about prepping slabs a couple days, hours, whatever, before you need to use them. I rolled this one out as you guys were walking in and getting seated. I like them kind of on the soft, malleable end of slab building. So usually I'm looking for a little bit of a different set of circumstances with my slabs than a lot of people hand building with them. I'm going to talk through like my slab process, and then I'll talk a little bit about the templates I'm using. I tend to build at home right now, so I don't have a slab roller to roll giant slabs on. My current process involves this lovely baking pin that I like because it's semi-adjustable. There's a couple different options for baking pins, but that was so far the easiest one for me. And usually I'm just building on my concrete floor on a board covered in canvas for like a work surface. So usually that's where I roll my slabs out. I throw them out on the floor, finesse them a little bit with the rolling pin, and then I like to compress the surfaces of my slabs. I don't like all of my inconsistencies to show, but also because I roll them on canvas, there's always like one little bit of a textured side that I like to kind of get rid of if I can. So I always run a really nice flat rib across my surface in both or multiple or all directions possible to kind of start to get the texture out. Kind of get everything aligned in the same direction. Just give me a really smooth surface to work on. Often with slabs, especially when they're this wet, it's good to get in the habit of continuously either rotating or keeping them on a semi-dry surface. So like you'll notice when I'm building that I'm kind of moving my slab around quite a bit because the slab mat that I'm using is going to get saturated pretty quickly. That being said, my slab starts to set up pretty quickly, so sometimes that has its benefits, but I have to watch and make sure it doesn't get stuck to things, which is why I'm not working directly on the table. I thought about this right before the demo, because if you work on a really slick surface with really wet slabs, you're going to fight it the whole time, it's going to get stuck to everything. So, put that on the other side. Feel free to ask me questions along the way. I have my general spiel kind of figured out, but I much prefer kind of a back and forth type of scenario than a lecture style scenario most of the time. Okay, so once my slab is kind of prepped, I've smoothed out both sides to the extent that I can at the moment. I guess I didn't really preface this by saying, like, I work pretty thin, too, for the size that I'm working with today. Like, usually, I think this is about an 1/8" slab, maybe, by the time it's done. Because I like to stretch my pots a little bit, I don't want that to be paper thin when I roll it out. I want to have a little bit of malleability and some room for my seams when I go to put it together. But I also don't want it to be hefty. Like, I don't like it to feel stereotypically hand-built, you know, like I want it to feel like it maybe came off of a wheel or something like that. So I build pretty thin, generally speaking. And then one of the more important steps I feel like for me in prepping a slab, partially because like I use a lot of texture tools, but today I'm going to be using like these wooden ones from MKM. I might be using some of these like ZM rollers that I think Cindy set out for me. With wooden tools and the way that I build, it's nice to have a surface that isn't this wet, fresh slab that I rolled out. I'm using it for a lot of its properties, but if I roll a texture on here and then I start messing with it, chances are I'm going to mush my texture all about pretty quickly. So I found that if I, combined with my tar paper that I'll explain in a minute, if I coat the surface in something like baby powder, cornstarch, something a little bit resistant, it protects my wooden tools from getting super saturated, so I can use them a little bit longer during the work session. Or if I have to roll them like 2 or 3 times to get a good coverage of the slab, it's not sticking to this wood, because that happens pretty quickly. But it also kind of gives me a false surface. I feel like it protects it a little bit as I'm working on it. Keeps me from immediately destroying the surface that I'm putting in my cup. So I kind of put it on here a little bit loosely, and then just kind of rub it over the surface. And usually I'm using baby powder. I found cornstarch also works. It just, I think in my experience, molds just slightly faster. So I do have to make sure that I don't put these immediately in a damp box for 3 weeks, because they will grow very, very black, and then it makes it very hard for me to mentally put a handle on it. I understand that it's probably not that bad, but like it's just harder when it's turned a totally different color to come back to it. So I do have to kind of finish up the greenware stage a little bit more readily, but it's fine. I still get a few days out of it if I'm smart about how I store them. But I rolled that kind of false surface on it. I think I'm gonna use this brand new squiggly guy I just found around the corner, like I needed another roller. As I was prepping today, I saw another one that I, clearly needed. So here we are. When I'm using a roller, I try to I almost use it like I'm rolling a really long coil. Like I try to get as much surface area on the roller as possible, so I can keep it as even as possible across the slab. Partially because I think that's like one of the tells of using these rollers is just kind of like if you get a weird unevenness, they're hard to go back over. But if you can get it all the way down, right, it's really satisfying to me. So I think that one is probably big enough for my, I've started kind of building my templates a convenient size, so they're in theory the same size as the rollers. Previously, I was building them just like an inch too tall and realizing that none of my texture tools were the right size for the thing to be continuous, which was the whole goal. But I'm going to roll 2 out so that I maybe have another one for the foot. I like to sometimes not have matching textures on my pots. Gives them a little bit of variation.
If you want to make taller pots, they do make longer.
I know, and I have started buying the longer ones for, I have a series of birds that I'm now hand building as well, that I bought the longer rollers for.
I haven't seen this one.
In fact, I have 2
I
right
probably
here.
ordered it, but I haven't seen
This one is technically one of my current favorites, I think,
Yeah.
and it's a longer one. But it just shows up real nice. Like it's really satisfying. So I do have a few longer ones, but previously all my favorite ones were in this little I just made my templates a little bit shorter so that they fit. But I also found a new cup size I like, so it's fine. Okay, so I tend to I template my shapes a little bit like I sew. I'm a little bit of a freehander. I don't have a lot of super expertise patterning background. So often I have iterations of things. So I've brought a few different templates that are kind of past versions of the form that I'm going to work on. This was, I think, my very, very first one. It honestly folds up to look like an ice cream cone. And there was so much cleanup with this shape by the time I got it the form I actually wanted to that I started kind of changing a few things. I made it a little squatter. I tried to make it a little bit heavier in areas I was going to round out. Eventually, I just redid the entire template, right, to be a little bit smarter about my time. Sometimes it takes me a few tries to get the quote unquote efficient route down for a form. These ones, when I was building them, didn't have a bottom, right? So I was having to cut a tiny little slab, add a bottom, add the foot, except it was just one more little slab to add onto this cup, so hence one more seam. I feel like I've narrowed this cup in a little bit better now. So we'll talk about we can pass this around if you want. These templates are made out of, initially I start patterning with just like paper, so just some sort of cardstock. That inevitably doesn't last that long because if you stick it on a slab this wet, your cardstock is immediately going to stick down and then start disintegrating. This is tar paper, which is just roofing paper. It comes in a massive roll, so usually if you like it, like go in on a roll with somebody because it's going to last you years. But it's really nice because it's stiff enough to help hold a shape of like a soft slab that I'm going to be using. It's semi-protectant of the surface, but it's still pliable. And it's also pretty water resistant. So this lasts forever if you're like treating them, unless you're sitting here like bending them back and forth for years. These are pretty durable. So usually if I have like a final form that I actually like, I make it out of tar paper so it lasts a little bit around my studio. This one, you can tell I haven't wanted to remake this one yet, but I somehow accidentally chopped off the end. So this one's just hanging in there for a little bit until I redo it. But those are kind of the iterations of that. Generally, when I roll out, or once I've rolled out my slab, there's a smooth and a rougher side to the tar paper. Smooth side is usually the side I put down. These are all minimal things, but sometimes they make a difference. I also know when I'm building that generally I'm going to cut a tiny bit off of the rim. So if anything, if the rim area of my slab isn't perfect, that's a part that I'm going to touch up later. So I've learned to be a little bit less focused on this edge, whereas everything else I want to be pretty consistent. Because I'm working pretty soft, I don't usually find the need to use an X-Acto blade. I tend to, I had kind of fallen in love with this little dual-sided needle / scoring tool because it means I also don't have to have a serrated rib next to me, which is my other favorite scoring option. So, this one's just not really fit on this. When I cut things, I find very important, especially in slabs, but really in any sort of hand building, I like to overlap my seams. So I have a lot of places where the clay has to come together on this pot and kind of fold over in a way on top of itself. And I don't want like butt joints up against each other. I want like a solid seam. And so often I will cut everything at kind of a 45 so there's more overlap to where they're attaching. With templates, sometimes it's a little bit easy to overthink which direction all of your bevels need to go, which I found to be one of the easiest things for me to mess up on this if I start like being in my head about it. So the easiest way, aside from these funny little spots on the bottom that I've now made to overlap on my foot, is to just hold my tool going one direction and kind of follow my template. And if I keep my tool consistent, then when I fold up my template, in theory, most of my sides come together pretty well. The exception to that are these two little bottom areas where I have to remember which one goes on top and which one goes on bottom. But aside from that, I feel like I finally kind of figured out this system.
I'm so glad you said that because my instinct would be to like cut all of one side one direction and then change it the other direction, but that would,
for
that
the
would not
first
work.
few 20 or so times I tried to do this,
Yeah, because
I would overthink the heck out of it and then do that and then fold it up and be like, well, now it doesn't. That's the opposite. The opposite of what I want. Like that's the opposite. So I really have to like keep myself from being. It's like no, it's simpler than everything's simpler than you want it to be. This one I just sometimes have to think like, okay, this one's going to go on top because it's the end one. So sometimes I'm thinking about that bit, but. And then the top I'm just going to cut off semi-straight. Sometimes I cut it at a bevel if I've got like a really thick slab and I know I'm going to not use all of it. And then sometimes I use the template to build the cup and sometimes I don't. I will be entirely transparent about that. It kind of depends on how soft my slab is. because when it's this soft, like when it's so squishy that I'm like having to be careful lifting it up, the tar paper is helpful in holding the texture and the shape a little bit more. If the slab is a little bit more set up and I can kind of lift it without worrying about it stretching, then maybe I don't need the template. But from there, depending on what I'm doing, I might leave the, I'm actually not sure if the template's doing me a lot of good on this one because I pulled it a little bit sideways. I've stretched it so it isn't lengthwise now, so my template's a little bit shorter, right? So this is one of the caveats of like really soft slab buildings. Like sometimes you get a little bit of distortion. It's not anything that you're gonna notice, but it is, if I try to keep that template on it, gonna maybe be a little bit more difficult. So rather than that, I'm just going to set it up on its rim. Usually I'm a little bit more on top of putting it. I want like a non-stick surface to work on, right? So I don't immediately stick this to the banding wheel. And then I have my overlapping seam at the edge. Usually I do this seam first. Sometimes I find it easier to fold up on this little form the edges and then do this final seam last. But it really depends on how soft the slab is, because if it's not holding its own shape upright, it's much easier to attach this seam first so that it keeps its shape. Like a cylinder would be much more durable than this funny little origami shape that I'm working with. But right now it seems to be pretty stable upright on its own, so I'm going to start from this middle seam and work my way out, just because it's easier to get my hands in all of these seams to work on them from that angle.
If you decide you want some stiffer clay, Rachel and I just found some pretty stiff red brick road in the studio room, if you want to.
Okay, that's okay.
You let me know if that's too soft.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I grab some photos of you?
Oh, we've already got 2 video cameras.
Oh,
So you're good. I've already got permissions.
Yeah, either way. I tend to, because I typically build pretty soft, I tend to not find the need to formally slip my pots. I tend to keep my scoring tool wet while I'm scoring, and I'm a really aggressive scorer. So generally speaking, the slip kind of builds up on the surface by itself, especially when the clay is this soft. But generally speaking, I don't keep slip around, so when I score and slip, I'm mostly scoring. And then when I go to attach things, I'm going to be really gentle on the outside of this seam. I'm going to resist the urge to like immediately squish it together, because that's going to botch all that texture work that I've just done, right? And so generally I give it a little bit of compression from the inside with my thumb, and then I'm just going to attach it for now until I get them all put together, and then I'll go inside and work that a little bit better once this is drier. The wetter the seam is, the more it's going to mess with the texture, the more you mess with it. So if I let it stiffen up for a second, it'll be a little bit more forgiving. Sometimes this last seam is a little funky, because depending on if I cut these little tabby guys the right direction, it goes together a little bit easier or a little bit more difficult, depending on if the bevel changes direction. I think I got it the right direction this time.
If you get it in the wrong direction, you just make it work.
I don't usually it's fine, it just depends on, so like right now, oh, maybe I didn't get it right. It's fine. So right now the tab has to go on top, but it's like going under this side. Technically it would go under either. It has to go under one side or the other, the way that I've cut it, right? So it's not an unworkable thing. It just is sometimes easier one direction than the other.
So you leave that
But
side
that's not
seam
something.
open so you can get your thumb in there and.
Yeah, just 'cause sometimes I'll attach that first, like if it's really soft and I'm batch working a chunk of cups, like I might be making like 5 to 10 bodies at once, going back, making the feet, making the handles. In this case, I'm gonna maybe make 1 or 2 today, right in front of you, and so it kind of depends. Sometimes I'm working really, really soft and I just want to get all the cylinders formed so then I can go back and close up the bottoms. It depends on how stiff it is and what it wants to do. But yeah, it is a lot easier right now to get like my middle finger in the cup to support it so I don't lose as much shape closing it up. As if I had closed that, it's a little harder for me to then support the inside of the cup. So I kind of prefer to do it this way. Sometimes the clay isn't at that stage. And I try to be somewhat unfussy about my process, so sometimes I just make things work depending on what they're wanting to do. I kind of don't mind if my hand is a little bit evident in the process. I just have my control points and then but now that it's a closed form, it's going to be a little bit more stable, and I can kind of start to make sure that those overlaps are kind of looking how I want. Over the course of making these pots, I've kind of noticed that the more that I mess with the seam, the more I inevitably don't like it, or the more I feel like I have to keep fussing at it. So for like right now, this is a little rough, but I'm going to leave it there. Right, because like you can still see a little bit of the seam, but if I start to try to smooth it out right now, you're gonna see it more. And I'm gonna lose all my texture, and then it's just gonna be a couple bald spots around where I've attached it. And I find that less aesthetically pleasing than a line. So I'm just gonna leave the line for a minute. Let this stiffen up, do a time check really quick. And then in that period, I might go in and start prepping like my foot ring and my handles, right, so they can set up. Generally, like I said, I generally do this in kind of different stages. So I will prep a bunch of bodies and then go through and prep a bunch of handles and a bunch of feet. But I have kind of a multi-stage handle process right now. This one in particular was slab built, so this was built using a different template. It's hollow, so it's 2 little slabs built into a handle. It takes me a little bit of time. I don't do that very often, but I really like how it feels. These other ones are a variation on just kind of a little textured strip of clay. So I pull a regular handle and then I texture it and I curve it to fit the pot. So that being said, sometimes it's smart for me to get my handles going a little bit early because they need a little bit of a drying period. Again, depending on the clay, sometimes I will pull them. I might actually do both today just so I know that I have one that's ready to go here in a minute. Sometimes I start my lugs by pulling them. Since this is pretty soft clay, it's pulling pretty easily, but it's going to maybe take a minute to dry before I can do the next step. If I want to do the next step a little bit faster, sometimes I don't pull them. And we'll set this one aside so I can still use it.
So when you have a cup day, how many cups can you, what do you, like half
It really
dozen, or
depends on the day.
how many will you do?
Probably like a half dozen is a good, like, I don't know that, I don't build fast right now. But also, honestly, I don't know that I hand build to make fast pots at the
So you like
moment,
make-
so I kind of,
Make all the bodies?
yeah, I'll try to make like quite a few bodies in one sitting, and then try to make time to like either come back to the feet at least the same day. If I have the opportunity, Handles I don't mind putting off, but often if I put off a round of handles, then I'll come back and decide that they're all going to be cups, and I don't want to make handles. So often if I set out to make a batch of mugs, it's good for me to like try to get through most of the processes so that they are all mugs. Just because I like to put handles on my pots. Well, I go through handle moods, I suppose. So sometimes I really don't mind making them, and then sometimes I really just don't care to make handles. So I suppose that's the difference, is just whether or not I'm in the mood to actually put the handles on, and if not, they all become a round of cups, and I just go from there. But sometimes if I'm not pulling them, I will just start with a little lug that I kind of pinched out with my fingers. I do taper the edges a little bit if I don't pull them with water, because I feel like this method makes a little bit more of a coil shape, and I like it if it's a little bit more oblong in your hand. So that one I could probably use pretty immediately. But now that these seams have started to stop being tacky, I'll probably go back to that so those guys can set up a little bit. When I am shaping and reinforcing these seams, I like to support this side of it. Depending on how wet it is, will change what I'm supporting this side with. Sometimes I do it with foam if it's like really, I'm just gonna take some of this slip off of here so it's not sitting in my hand wet. If it's really soft, I'll sometimes put it in a piece of foam to hold it while I sit and shape it. Otherwise, I really like to have the feeling of how much pressure I'm putting on it with my hand. So a lot of my shaping I do with the bottom kind of cupped in my palm, so that I can tell if I'm like getting it somewhat even, or if I'm pushing a seam too far. I'll also kind of be able to feel that on the other side. And so the inside of my cup right now looks pretty rough, right? You can tell it's a slab. You can also tell it was folded. So I like to put, because I'm going to be stretching this pot a little bit, I like to put a tiny little reinforcing coil along those seams. Sometimes I score and slip this in there, sometimes I don't, because again, the clay is so dang soft right now that it might not need scoring and slipping. Sometimes this is my favorite. I know it's not the most forgiving time to work with clay, but I really like when it's this soft, because it really just doesn't care how much you squish it around. It doesn't care, like, if I can't get my scoring tool into this corner right here, it's not like the worst case in the world. It's still pretty soft and malleable in there. So then I'm just going to squish a little coil in here. And often I get better compression with a wooden knife than I do with my fingers in a pot this size, especially. So I like these little like spoon-shaped, I don't know what these things are called, but they're like a wooden modeling tool. I have several sizes of them around, but I think this little one is my favorite. And I'm just going to go in and kind of squish that reinforcing coil into the pot. I'm not too concerned if I get it perfectly even right now, but I do want to be supporting the seams, so I'm not stretching them yet. And really compressing that into that joint.
It's only 12:30, you're good.
Okay, cool.
You mind if I like film over your shoulder?
I was trying to figure out like how to find your angle without looking back over my shoulder at you, and I'm like, I don't know where you're at right now. It's okay. Right. Yeah, so I'm always making sure to kind of support it if I'm turning it or if I'm pushing on any area. I want it to be backed by my palm, so I'm not de-shaping it. And then when I go to put the initial shape in here, I'm gonna kind of just push. I kind of start with my fingers, and I want to get this middle section between the joints to sort of round out to meet where my seams are to start with. So I kind of start in the middle. Ooh, this guy's soft. Okay. And then sometimes, and I'm going to do this a little early just so that it holds its shape a little bit better. I take a little bit of a loose, like a pinch approach to the way that I'm going to form the rest of this pot. And right now it's pretty soft, so I'm going to take and kind of collar in the neck a little bit just so that when I start stretching it, the stretch looks a little more emphasized, right? Like kind of this spot right here where it just comes in a little bit under the neck. That's not built into my template because it's so slight that typically I just take it and I kind of pinch it in a little bit. And I use a pretty similar hand to like if I were collaring something in on the wheel, we want to kind of do it in the round. And so that we're kind of supporting the part that we're compressing against. Okay. So that was a little maybe dramatic, but it's going to stretch out a little bit as I work on the belly. But that just starts to give it a little bit of form.
Knowing you're going to do that, do you really think about what texture you use that's going to be able to handle squeezing and expanding?
Good question. Yes, I sometimes certain textures work better than others, or sometimes the texture, I guess, is more dependent on how stiff I want to build. So a lot of the textures I pick are really bold and really like can handle a little bit of compression and a little bit of stretch before they lose their detail. So I mentioned earlier that like these two are my current two favorites, and it's because this one like this one can take quite a bit of pressure for some reason. I think just because they're so deep.
That
right?
surprises me.
Yes. I mean, I was surprised
over
at
there.
I was surprised at this little polka dotted one too because it's also very subtle. But like typically, I guess one of the nice things about the way that I build right now and the way that I fire is that a lot of those don't have to be super deep to show up on the surface. So like I lose a little bit of detail around the seams, even though I go through like these steps to preserve it, I am building pretty soft. So I'm gonna lose a little bit of that around the areas that I'm handling a lot. But I feel like the way that I'm firing right now kind of pulls it out a little bit regardless of how subtle it might be, right? Like I lose some of it, but most of it can be hardly there and it'll still sort of show up, right? So I'm not having a lot of
and
fit.
it adds to it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I think the variation of them is something that's kind of grown on me. I don't know that I initially expected it, but I do like that there's often, a lot of different angles where the texture might not be uniform all the way around. So,
Are handmade.
right. Yes. I think it took me a good chunk of my ceramic career to I don't know, get over like a lot of my perfectionist brain and like be like accepting of the things that happen in, I don't know, like I feel like I liked them before, but I didn't like them on my work, and now I'm like, no, I do. I'm okay with some of the happenstances, some of the things that like the kiln pulls out, and so now I'm just trying to work with it a little more. So, okay, so that's kind of what my bottom's looking like. Now that it's a little stiffer and I've started to get a little bit of shape, I can go in and kind of pinch the seam a little bit from the inside and outside, make sure it's really well attached, and also that like, I don't know, it looks kind of like what I want, right? I don't want a glaring seam, but I don't mind if it shows a little bit. So I'm just going in and making sure that like the belly is stretching fairly evenly. Sometimes with slabs built like this, the seam is a little reluctant to stretch because it's two overlapping spots. So I always like to go in and just make sure that everything's kind of happening in the round a little bit. if there's any like really thick spots on the seam, I might go in and pinch those a little bit. And then often I will leave the pinching of the rim, right? Like it still looks pretty slab built right now, but I'm gonna leave the rim a little bit rough for a little bit because that's gonna be the fastest thing to dry out. And I have found if I start pinching that too early and thin it out, then it gets a little bit more expedited that I need to get the handle and everything on, right? Because like it starts drying from the top down. Right now I'm focused on wanting the foot area to dry a little bit so I can put a foot ring on it. So I'm gonna leave the rim a little thick because I can always address that in a little bit. Okay, so sometimes depending on how fussy I'm being and how much I get done in the first iteration, I will do a round of like attaching or putting the bottoms together, go through, stretch them all the first time, and then let them stiffen a little bit to where I'm about to put the foot on, go back, do a little bit more work on the inside, make sure they're actually the shape I'm happy with before I put the foot on. I can stretch it a little bit after the foot ring's on, but it does change the level it sits on if I have to change it dramatically. So I like to put the foot on close to last. But I'm going to start getting that ready so that it can also set up a little bit. These extra slabs that I've rolled are often what I cut the foot ring out of. So since this is my little cup, oh, there we go. I couldn't find my internal circle cutter today, so I brought a circle mat, and we'll just cut it by hand. But often I have a smaller circle cutter that will cut the interior of this foot ring that is about the same size as this stamp that I have for the bottom. I made this stamp years ago at KU. And it just conveniently right now is the size that I try to build my feet so that I can fit my signature, my foot ring, and then the rest of the pot. Sometimes I don't nail it, and this is just slightly too wide for my foot ring. But we'll size it off of this guy today and make sure that we've got clearance. Because of course there was one thing I couldn't find. This one. Okay. And usually I'm pretty, I try to be pretty efficient in how I use my slabs. So often if I am batch working, I will try to use like every inch of a slab before I re-wedge what I haven't used. Clearly today I have not used this big chunk over here, but it should be re-wedgeable. It's still pretty soft. So usually because I build so soft, I can reuse my slabs for quite a while. It gives me a little bit of working time at least. I love when it just pops out and it almost did it. It's okay. It's okay. You're not a machine. It's okay. So sometimes if I'm going to make anything ahead of time or if I'm going to let something set up, it's this little foot ring that I've cut out. That might seem silly, but I really like just the tiny little bit of detail texture that I leave on the foot. It's very minimal, but it's something that makes me happy. And so if I put this on too fast and I flip the cup upright, it immediately squishes it, and then you don't see it at all. And then I might as well just be putting a coil on the foot. So this one I'm gonna maybe let set up somewhere. Got these tiny little slab mat trial things, I think, that they gave me free. And see, again, I found they work really well for cups because I don't like to have a wear board for something this small. It feels kind of silly. Okay, so this thing is already starting to have a little bit more shape, right? Or like a little bit more structure as well. Part of that is because I've given it shape, but it's also started to dry since we started, which is awesome. Okay, let's maybe set that aside for just like one more minute. I don't want to put the foot on too soon because then it really loses most of its belly shape. So I'm trying to resist doing that too quickly. So we'll go and talk about the handles for a minute. I'm glad I made the one that I didn't pull because this one's really soft still. But I make my handles somewhat similarly to how I roll my slabs. I found that you can texture the outside of this if you don't plan to do a ton of like cleanup work to it in a minute. So I try to get it most of the way there in terms of shape. And then similar process. Sometimes I use the rollers. Sometimes I prefer, I don't think I brought any with this guy on it. This is a pasta roller, so it's just like a noodle maker. But it gets a really nice little crisscross pattern on a coil if you are looking for like a weird or a different texture. I find this to be kind of a nice one. I might do that on this one because it's a little bit soft, and I think the wood would help maybe dry it out a tiny bit. Sometimes I do the same thing with my handles that I do with my slabs, especially if they're this soft. I like to protect the surface I'm putting on them a little bit, especially because I'm going to be squishing them here in a minute, and I want them to hold that texture as long as possible. If I'm using the roller, I like to put a little bit of a bevel on my handles, right? I'm reinforcing that kind of oblong shape to them. So rather than rolling them just flat across like a slab, I'm going to take them a little bit at an angle and actually use this kind of bevel on the corner to kind of roll it on the table. I'm going to do this direction. And I don't want to put a ton of pressure on there, but I want enough that it picks up the texture. Right? I just don't want to lose all the shape. Right, so that's one half. Then if you take it the other way, it'll kind of even out a little bit in the middle. There we go. So then I have kind of a nice little like start of a handle lug. Smooth on one side, textured on the other. This guy, dual. Yeah. Okay. So this one, depending on which way you roll it, it'll roll either lines if you keep them going the same direction, or it'll roll kind of a crisscross pattern if you turn it opposing directions. So I'm going to turn it the opposing direction. Logically, I should have a bigger noodle roller because I can't roll. The one downside to this is that I can't roll it all at once if I want a really long handle. So sometimes I will take it and then, roll it back on itself to cover that bottom section. Really, the side I'm most concerned about is the outside. The inside of the handle, I'm going to lose that texture again here in a minute, just based on the way that I form it. But I have kind of a cute little handle lug now. I squished this a little bit aggressively, so I might lose that little bit when we shape it, but I've made two, so we have a spare. If that's a problem, we'll know here shortly. This next bit I kind of ripped off a little bit from Danny Meisinger. He puts a whole lot of videos on his website about like how he makes his work, and he makes these lovely little textured lug handles for his giant sort of amphora shaped pots. And so when I was making these little guys, I was having some trouble getting the curve right? Like I can kind of curve it by hand, I can get pretty close. But one thing I find very, very satisfying now that I have figured out how to do it by watching Danny is this sort of little handle trick. And we're going to keep the side of the handle that looks better on the outside because that's the texture I'm going to keep a little bit more of. And then I'm going to kind of make a ribbon curl. So I wet my fingers down and then I'm going to compress into this piece of foam. And depending on how many fingers you are using to compress, right, it's going to kind of pressure curl this little handle that then makes the most perfect little one finger or two finger, whatever handle, right? So this, for some reason, solved a whole lot of my problems, partially because I can squish it into foam. It really helps me not mush all of my texture out of my handle, right? Because I don't have to put it right on the table. I don't have to form it around something stiff. So I lose a little bit. Sometimes I gain a little bit of foam texture, but on the handle, That's still usually pretty satisfying to me. On these longer ones, I don't have to use quite as much pressure typically to get it to curl, but I do kind of like to use it to refine the shape a little bit. So I'm not going to press as hard, but I do want it to curl a little bit. So I'm using 2 fingers this time and kind of just pushing it a little bit round, right? So it's like a little bit more subtle. And then depending on how I'm feeling when I attach it, I might go in here and kind of pull the edges of the handle a little bit thinner because it is still a little bit wide at the edge right now, but it's a pretty okay thickness to hold on to. So I'll kind of make that judgment as I attach it to the cup and have somewhere to hold it steady.
That was so magical.
Isn't it satisfying? Like I literally show that to like all my students now because I'm like, this is the most ridiculous thing you will ever see, but it works so good.
I just wonder how he discovered that.
I know, right? Like, what were you doing that you just
Messing
like
around or
ribbon curled your clay for the first time?
Danny.
Right. I don't know.
What
I feel
happens
like
if I do this thing?
most of the stuff that I pick up from other artists, I feel like are the stupidest little like. I'm like,
How did you come up with that?
what
What experimentation led
what
to that
happened
discovery?
that made this thing like this? Like I would recommend a green, like a Scotch-Brite sponge for like 98% of my studio problems.
Hmm,
And I learned that from Brett Kern.
there you go.
And I'm like, of all the stupid things that I could have learned from Brett Kern, carrying a Scotch-Brite around was probably the minimal one, but it's fine. Okay.
Stories.
So when I'm putting my foot on, okay, this has a little bit more shape now, which is good. I still like to do this pretty soft because I haven't found my efficient way to do this step yet. So I'm still kind of fussing through this guy, but I don't like how short this is. I really don't love how stubby this foot is. This was the first iteration, and it worked, but it's my least favorite. I like to think of my feet as pedestals, and so like I like it to have more height. I suppose I could do this by putting a giant coil on it and then squishing a texture and hoping I squish it flat. I don't trust myself to do that, so I have this roundabout way of just, I cut my foot ring. I'm gonna put a coil on the bottom of my pot, attach the foot ring to the coil, and then kind of finesse the attachment because I feel like it looks a little more like a trimmed pot the way that I'm currently doing it. I'm sure there's a better way. If you have suggestions, feel free. I have not found it yet. But let's say I'm happy with my cup form. I'm gonna take, and I didn't preface all of this by saying I really prefer to build everything on a turntable. This was one of my first, I think, purchases in grad school when I got to here. It's probably the first thing on my Bracker's record, and I do everything on my turntable.
Is that the size you like, the 25H?
I think I have the slightly shorter one, but the same wheel head.
Yeah.
And I couldn't live without my turntable. So that's my one endorsement. There you go. I almost botched that already. So before I put my foot ring on, if I put my foot ring on and I don't stamp it, I can't fit my stamp on the foot. So that's one of those moments where I sometimes forget to do the things in the right order, and then I have to work around them later. So now that I know where my foot ring is going to be attached, because it's so soft, I'm going to stamp it with my fingers on the inside so that I can hopefully keep most of my shape down there, but get a good impression. I don't like stamping things when they're super stiff, because I feel like I'm usually more likely to deform them. So often I push a little bit from the inside to kind of meet my stamp on the outside. And then I can kind of build my foot ring around that. I'm going to just score around that line. I've made the line on the inside of the foot ring because if possible, I like to err on the inside so I don't see as much on the outside of the pot. And then I typically use a pretty tall coil. So like rather than, I do this when I coil build too, but rather than using it like round little coil that I just rolled out, I flatten it a little bit so it's taller than it is fatter. Because I don't really need like the attachment space, I just want the height. I'm going to attach that on that line. It's not perfect, it's not the worst thing in the world, but I want to try to get it as round as I can to where I made that mark. And then this is a place where I go back to that funny little like wooden carving tool. It kind of looks a little bit like a finger, and so I feel like it kind of does a good job of compressing and giving me a little bit of added pressure without like the slickness in my hands. And I'm just barely kind of going around the inside of this to sort of seal the edge in place.
So is this a $50 teacup?
At least.
I think I have 35 on that one over there.
That's a whole other
I
question
know,
about
sometimes-
pricing your work.
I know, right? Well, pricing, time, it's all just kind of crazy. And then I think about how long I could sit and fuss with one of these
Yeah.
pots, and I'm like, that's part of it that I just am no good at thinking about. It's hard to. And then because this is a little bit of a finger shape, I like to start making my little curve of a foot on here, kind of like a trimming tool. I have a trimming tool that's a very similar shape. But essentially I'm just kind of pushing that foot a little bit into the pot, holding this tool at an angle and kind of smoothing that coil and the foot together. I really like kind of an undercut foot, so kind of back to like trimming and kind of looking wheel thrown, I suppose. I like it when my foot comes out at a little bit of an angle. Partially because I think it looks nice. It makes things, I think, look less heavy when they aren't like flat to the table. But also it makes it, you get around to glazing or like anything else, I really like having a stable hold on my feet. That's something I just can't get away from, is like I want something to hold on to while I'm working with it at later stages. So I'm just going in here and kind of re-smoothing those together. If I want to stretch my foot ring out at any point, so like sometimes I put this on and I decide it needs to be just slightly more pitched out, it's still soft enough that I can treat it a little bit like the body, and I can kind of mush it out a little bit with the tool. And then as it sets up, as it sets up, so I'll let this dry a tiny bit, but then I will go back in with, after I've flipped it over, pinched the rim out a little bit, let this stiffen, I'll go back in with a rasp on this foot, as well as this guy. So like this little half curve, like half moon shaped curving tool. It's like a Dolan, yeah. Or I think Kemper sells a similar shape.
Yep, they do.
Since Dolan is no longer. But it's a similar shape to this like spoon curve that I like so much, right? So it like makes a similar curve, and that's how I'll finish cleaning up kind of the underside of that. I just give it like a little bit more of a clean cut edge. Just kind of what happens there, and then I'll take a rasp to just give it a tiny little bit of a bevel around the top of the foot so that it has a little bit of shadow underneath it when it sits. All just aesthetic things that I prefer in the long run. And then typically before I rasp it, I like to give it a little bit of time for that foot ring to set up. So once I've attached the foot, I might go in and start like pinching the rim up a little bit. Depending The amount I pinch the rim kind of depends on the overall shape. Like if I've rolled my slabs a little thicker that day, I might have a different shape than if I've rolled it thinner because I can get away with a little bit more stretching and a little bit more manipulating. But generally I like to just pinch the rim a little bit to thin it out at the top, give it kind of a faux finish up here that looks a little more tapered, rather than so clean cut off of a slab. And then sometimes I'll, like if I want a little bit of a taller cup, I might go in and like pinch this rim a little bit just to kind of give it a little bit more height. But often it depends entirely on the portion of like where this belly's sitting that day.
I really do like that texture.
I do too.
So
It's like
topographical.
it's brand new, I might have to, yeah. Sometimes I look at them and I'm not sure what they're gonna look like on the thing, and then they end up being my favorites for different reasons. So this is a point where I might go in and like be a little more fussy about whether I got it level, right? Like if I got my rim even all the way around, I can take it now and kind of finesse that, especially now that it has a foot, right? I know kind of where it's gonna be sitting. This is still a little soft, so this might be one that I would set aside for a few minutes, let the bottom stiffen so that it holds its shape. But it's pretty close. From there, I would work on picking out like maybe how long I wanted my handle to be. I would finish shaping it a little bit more and then decide like how much handle I need for this pot. I always cut my handle out of bevel in an upward direction, right? So that it kind of follows this lip line a little bit. I think sometimes I'm okay with a little bit of like a shelf handle where it comes out straight, but I think in this thicker version is kind of the only time I tend to enjoy the way this feels. Otherwise, I like it to have just a tiny bit of like upward curve. Right? When I'm not pulling them, it's good to like cut it in that upward curve and kind of reinforce the way that's shaped. So I'll cut it a little bit at a bevel upward and also a little bit round, right? So I get kind of like I suppose like a little snake mouth looking thing on this end. And then, just like an aesthetic seam choice, I find it nice to stick the handle over the long seam of the cup,
Yeah.
right? Because like, if you're gonna pay the least attention to something, it's gonna be under the handle where chances are you're gonna be distracted by other things. Not that I really hate that seam, right? Like it's not too offensive to me, but I do often pick that point to put the handle over. I also feel like it might give some sort of extra reinforcement to that. Like, I don't know if that's entirely true, but it makes my brain feel better sometimes, right? Or the opposite, I guess. And then I do a lot of my finishing. This is slightly soft, and I don't know how long you all want to stick around for this information, but I do most of my finishing is done with like these three guys. I really like a rasp or like a Sureform. I prefer using them without the handle, which is why this is a silly little lonely guy here. And I will take all the high points off of the rim, make sure it feels pretty even. And then this, the Scotch-Brite bit that I was talking about earlier is gonna be like right before I take like finishing sponge to it. And generally I will use this like folded over the rim or on one side on the inside to kind of take my fingerprints and sort of the high points off. These, when they're wet, are kind of like a nice like sandpapery option. They're fairly abrasive and they will cut off a little bit of the clay as you go a little bit more efficiently than like a clay sponge. A clay sponge will do the same thing, but it will also like smooth out quite a bit. So like this guy's a little more abrasive. And then I've just recently started using this elephant ear again because it's really soft and it feels like a finishing sponge. I can get a similar look, but it's slightly more abrasive, it seems like, than like a makeup sponge or like that soft squishy guy. So it also takes off a little bit more. So I guess these guys maybe are my finishing bits.
From grittiest to smoothest.
From grittiest to smoothest, yeah. So I am a little fussy about like how I finish the rims out, but generally that's to keep them looking from like, you know, cut off slabs. So that's why I get kind of a softer thing with those kind of finish on like you would on a wheel.